everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. I am here for a conversation that is a key part of ISACA's strategic direction, and that topic is digital trust. I am Kristen Kessinger, Director of Communications at ISACA, and joining me today, live from the ISACA Global offices, are Karen Heslop, Vice President of Content Development at ISACA, and Mark Thomas, President of Scout Consulting and a member of ISACA's Digital Trust Task Force. Hi, Mark and Karen.
Hey, good morning.
Hey, Kristen.
So before we dive into the specifics, Karen, could you give us a little bit of information about ISACA's definition of digital trust?
Sure, I would be thrilled to, Kristen. So just as a way of background, ISACA has really been looking at digital trust for the last year, and we've had a lot of really good, let's say, rigorous conversation about the definition of digital trust. And so how ISACA defines digital trust is the confidence in the integrity of the relationships, interactions, and transactions among providers and consumers within an associated digital ecosystem. This includes the ability of people, organizations, processes, information, and technology to create and maintain a trustworthy digital world. So and digital trust focuses on how trust manifests itself in a digital context. When you think about this, and I know it's a lot to digest, when you think about this, ISACA, when we use the word providers, we want you to interpret that word as broadly as possible. It is meant to include suppliers and anyone offering goods or services that can be digitally enabled. Likewise, consumers should also be thought of very broadly. ISACA believes consumers, as part of this definition, includes users, customers, partners, or any party to a digital transaction.
So that definition is pretty inclusive when you compare it to some other organizations that tend to focus more on security. Mark, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, this is much more broad than security. And to follow up on one of the things that Karen was saying, just how coming up with the definition and scope was huge here. Right. Because one of the things we really don't want to do is say this is just business financial transactions only, those types of things. So it was really important that we focused on what the specific definition of what we thought digital trust was, so we can open this up to more than just commerce between business. So many different things. So I think that was really important. But since you mentioned, hey, this doesn't really have a specific security flavor to it, that's absolutely true. This is much deeper, much more broad than just security. For example, we have several tenets that we look at from the digital trust perspective: governance, risk, assurance, security, privacy, and quality. And so all of these, if you think about these tenets as ingredients to this overarching digital trust program that you might have, I think it's important to really think about all those areas. So not just the security focus, not just the privacy focus, but a combination of those tenets. Now, I think that one of the really important pieces here is just more than just having these tenets, that there are some characteristics that really need to be achieved for an organization to gain digital trust. And of course, we're going to talk about this as we walk through here, but things like transparency, things like accountability, ethics, responsible use of technology. So there's a lot of pieces involved here. And again, not just focusing on the security piece, and really trying to focus on all types of digital interactions between what Karen said, between a producer or some organization that is providing something and a consumer. Again, that's not necessarily end consumer as a person. It could be any person, any organization that's consuming that outcome. So anyway, kind of a neat approach to it. I like it.
So when you look at those tenets, it makes sense for ISACA members to play a big role in digital trust. But in your perspectives, why would you say ISACA members are the right people to advance the pursuit of digital trust?
Well, I would say, again, because ISACA serves IT auditors and information security professionals and IT risk professionals and privacy professionals, because all of those professions and topics underpin digital trust, ISACA is the natural organization to foster an interest in digital trust and to evangelize why digital trust is so important. The professions that ISACA serves and the professionals are anything from those securing cybersecurity professionals to privacy professionals to all of that work contributes to digital trust.
You got it.
What do you think,
And
Mark?
they're in positions around the globe, right? And privacy is cybersecurity, the areas that you just talked about. But these are members who are in highly advanced technical organizations, and they may be in less technical advanced, maybe manufacturing or something like that. But they're in positions to really help look at how we propagate it and understand how digital trust is a critical factor to any organization's transactions. So it really makes a lot of sense that the membership of ISACA and the roles that they have in the industry are a huge benefit for digital trust.
Yeah.
Can you give us some specific examples, Mark, of some types of things that our members do that really help to advance digital trust in their organizations?
Yeah, sure. So interesting. So if you think about digital trust, and I always make the joke that something is everybody's job, but if everybody's doing it, nobody's doing it, right? So everybody has a piece to play in here. It's not always that role that touches the end user or the customer. In this case, let's take auditing for example. One of the things that we're really looking at now is how do I make sure that the assurance that we're providing for the organization really understands that we have digital trust embedded in the organization. Right, a lot of that information on how I look at things from an auditing perspective is still being put into development now. From a security privacy perspective, are we, as a privacy professional or a security professional, are we now looking at digital trust by design, just like we look at security by design or privacy by design? So these folks in roles that are deploying new technologies and deploying new products and services that are key to get this integrated in. So from a specific, you asked for kind of a specific, so we've, of course, most of the roles that Karen talked about earlier, right, they're in a direct relationship to be able to do this. I think one of the important things we're starting to see now, though, is in addition to technology professionals, now we're starting to see really more the service owners and the product owners of the services and products that are being that have a digital transaction as playing a very, very big role in baking in digital trust in there.
Agreed.
So we all play a role in digital trust and have some responsibility, but who at an organization is typically ultimately responsible?
I'm going to keep going because if it's everyone's job, nobody's doing it. And so I kind of joked about that with like win quality, right? Everybody's job, but there does have to be an agency within the organization or some type of governance oversight, I believe. Now we could all laugh and say, sure, the CEO is accountable for everything. We always love to say that. But I would say that when we're talking about who owns this, at what level is the most actionable accountability that we can delegate to somebody to really help us from a trust perspective? I mentioned something a minute ago that I think that from my perspective and what I'm seeing right now is the role that's accountable for this is the role of that product or that service owner who owns that service or product that requires some type of digital interaction or digital transaction. Because that, now, in the old days, we had a lot of analog things that took place. And today there's so many digital interactions that need to take place. If I'm the product owner or the service owner of that service that's being exchanged between myself and a consumer, I believe that is probably the key role that should own this. Should we go create a new committee that reports to the board for this? You guys know that we committee everything, all right? It's very difficult right now on a lot of boards because of multiple committees. I don't believe this is a committee type of thing, right? I truly think that if we have privacy by design and privacy really baked into all the activities in the organization, I do believe that we do need to have official reporting, things like that, but we'll kind of see how it grows into it. And a lot of larger organizations may have to.
I would add, though, that everybody in an organization, in an enterprise, is responsible for digital trust, right? And as Mark alluded to, right, this is really much more of a business concept than a information and technology concept. Certainly, information and technology is a huge part of digital trust. But think about it, your marketing group needs to really own digital trust to make sure that any advertisements or brochures they're coming out with are accurate and reflect the honest state of affairs. It goes to brand management, right? That's your marketing group. HR needs to ensure that not only are they being ethical, but they are also providing the employees with the tools they need so that the employees can be digitally trustworthy or have the tools. So really, this touches everybody within an organization.
Yep, I agree.
So when you look at it that way, and with all the activities involved, it's a lot for an organization to undertake. And, of course, they'd expect to see some ROI there. So have you seen some of the benefits organizations have reaped from being more digitally trustworthy?
Sure, absolutely. I'd like to address that. I think there's a couple areas that I think are key here. Number one is efficiency that organizations are getting into this. Now, Stephen Covey wrote the book. It was called Speed of Trust. And in Speed of Trust, what Covey says is a trusted relationship results in affecting two things: cost and speed. The more trust you have, the less cost and the more speed, and obviously the opposite of an organization that has less trust. So when we look at efficiencies from that point, I think when we're looking at cost and speed, go to market, and furthermore relationships with our customers, which is the second one I think is important, and customer relationships and so on. So with higher trust, obviously we have a better relationship, and we may have more repeat business, and lifetime customers that might result from that. And again, that's a lot of that is also going to stem to efficiencies also. But I think,
and I think on that point, Mark, right? Not only is it repeat business, but it's recommending to a colleague, hey, you should go buy this product or work with this organization. They're really great.
Valid point. Absolutely. And it kind of links back to the roles you talked about: sales, marketing. So there's a lot of connections there. But I think another one that I think would be interesting to note is your supply chain, third party, right? We're outsourcing everything these days. I can't think of a single product or service my organization has that doesn't have some form of outsourcing. So where's the trust in that? Because now we look at, if we have higher trust in my outsourcing or my third parties, how do I know that they have trusted relationships with their third parties and so on? And just like in manufacturing and goods, where we have a supply chain that handles actual physical goods, we're talking about information and data here that we may not be able to control if it's several generations away from us, right?
Absolutely true, right? What are the data protection policies of a third, fourth, fifth party holding your data, right? Do you have any visibility into that? It's kind of scary.
So I think to kind of sum it up from the benefits perspective, of course, we talked about, your efficiency, your customer relationships, and of course, having a little more visibility into your supply chain, I think is huge, which obviously would support you for your efficiency as well.
Perfect. And related to that, stay tuned for results on a supply chain security survey coming from ISACA the first week of June. So we'll have a lot more insight on that, and another ISACA live episode on that topic. For now, for digital trust, where do you think the average organization falls in terms of a digital trust maturity level? And what are some practical steps they might be able to take to improve where they are now?
Yeah, so it's really, when you look at overall maturity, right? There's a big difference between digital trust maturity when it comes to a global global retailer versus a local bicycle manufacturer, right? So there's a lot of different things, but I would say on average, here's what I believe. I believe that organizations believe they're mature because what they think is, because people are transacting with us and buying and using our product, that means they trust us. So I'm not sure a lot of organizations really know what those factors are, those trust factors that really should be taking a look at in an organization, because you may be selling product, but people may be buying from you because there is no other alternative, and they still don't trust you. So I think that from a maturity perspective, again, depends on the industry. I would say for more technically savvy organizations, digitally transformed organizations, they're somewhat mature, but there's pieces that they don't quite understand in terms of what are the risks that are involved. And so those are some things we really try to address with digital trust and the framework that we're looking at here. But I think one of the things that's important to really look at is there some type of reference model out there? There's a lot of them out there that exist today, and I think in order for me to increase my digital trust maturity level, I think it would be good for me to have some type of reference, just like a framework of sorts that gives me some type of factors that I can now break those pieces down, because I may be strong in some areas and other areas be weak and not know it.
I would agree. I think too, there's a lot of really efficient and mature organizations out there. People, organizations that use COBIT or that use CMMI, right? I think what ISACA is really trying to get people to think about is, from a governance perspective, I might be highly mature, right? From a program or process improvement perspective, performance improvement, I might be highly mature. But I don't necessarily think of it in terms of that broader digital trust. And so what ISACA is trying to do is say, hey, professional, hey, enterprise, start thinking about your practices and how they impact digital trust, and where you can develop new practices or activities that will enhance your trustworthiness and therefore ideally enhance your revenues and your operations.
Yeah, and kind of along those lines is understanding those. What are the transactions and the interactions that take place, right? Because some of these transactions are financial, some are non-financial. Some of these transactions are recurring transactions, and some are one-time only. And so, having a good inventory of how those pieces fit together, I think, would be a really, really good starting point for organization. Inventory, what interactions actually take place.
Right.
Mark, you mentioned a framework earlier, and you teed us up perfectly for the next question. So ISACA has a digital trust framework coming out toward the end of the year. Can you both tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So we at ISACA Global started developing a digital trust framework. We immediately convened a global task force to help us in these development efforts. Some of you might be aware that in April, we came out with an exposure draft of that framework. And we got, over 1,200 comments on it from, close to 90 different commentators, again, across different industries, across different professions, and across different geographic regions. So we are in the process at ISACA of digesting those comments, reflecting the comments in the framework. And as Kristen said, we will be publishing this framework in the fourth quarter of 2022.
All right. Looks like we have 3 questions from the audience. I can take the first one, which is, does ISACA offer any cybersecurity scholarships? And I would encourage you to check with your local chapter, as well as the One in Tech Foundation. Both of those organizations tend to offer scholarships. So that will be a good resource for you. Another person, Harvey, asks, how much of a role does zero trust capabilities play into digital trust?
If you think about digital trust as kind of a framework looking into this, I think that is obviously when we talk about transparency and we talk about all the tenets that we have, I do think it plays a role. Because I think any efforts that organizations going through from a zero trust perspective, it certainly would be a foundational element to your digital trust framework. So it's not a separate type of activity. I truly think that it would be integrated into any organization's trust factors as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say, zero trust is a good security practice, and certainly good security practices really foster digital trust.
Yeah.
Are there any maybe entry-level type careers available here? Someone who hasn't worked in tech who might be able to come over and find opportunities in this area?
Oh, yeah, I certainly would believe so.
Absolutely.
Again, just we saw the same thing. When security and cybersecurity, and of course now all of a sudden we're having a shortage on information and security professionals. We're seeing that from a privacy perspective. If I had a crystal ball, I certainly would expect that there are roles. There are probably several roles that could emerge from digital trust, but I'm not sure that this creates dozens of new roles that that has a whole part of the organizational structure. I think most of them can be blended into some current roles, I believe.
Yeah, I would add, sort of interpreting that question a little differently, for digital natives, right? So people my daughter's age, they often, I find, just give information out without batting an eyelash, without thinking about how is the organization to whom I'm giving that data, how are they going to protect that data? How are they going to ensure my privacy? Right? I do think there is some skepticism and some concern from, and I'm generalizing, sort of those that aren't digital natives, right? And I think that population brings a very important perspective to just the concept of digital trust.
We have 3 questions that just came in more about the framework. So some one wants to know the key elements of the upcoming framework. Another asks, are we aiming for the digital trust framework to result in something like a number of ISO compliance frameworks that one can certify? Any responses related to those?
I can start off from a general organizational perspective of this. What we want to do is really look at this framework from a larger perspective first, so that we can. This is a lot of information to break it down into really more of a taxonomy. So we start with what are called nodes at a very high level: people, process, technology, organization, and so on. And these nodes are connected through what we call domains. We had a lot of different discussions on what we even call these things, but then these domains really break down into what I believe the core of this framework, and they're what we call trust factors. And I think those trust factors are really the point of this framework that are going to help people really look at how you adopt the good practices for this.
I would add that and again, ISACA will have a lot of forthcoming information about the framework as 2022 continues. But the framework really takes a systems thinking approach, and it says, if I change something in technology, that might have an impact on people. And so it understands that there are these dynamics between the nodes, and those are what the domains are. And so you always want to try to be in balance. And so understand that a change over here is going to impact something over here.
Yeah. So I think that's a pretty good summary, I believe, of a very large framework with a lot of good information in it. So, and again, reiterate that's what we didn't want, was a static framework.
Right, exactly.
All right. So as things change, obviously there's going to be effects elsewhere.
Right. Those dynamic interconnections are so important. As for the ISO question, the framework will have a number of mappings from the digital trust ecosystem framework that ISACA is developing to things like ISO standards and NIST, CFS and COBIT. So we do plan to have a lot of mappings from this framework to other frameworks. And we don't see that the digital trust framework will usurp any framework that an enterprise is currently using. We see it as a complement. So if you're using COBIT for governance, for example, there might be practices in digital trust that you want to implement because COBIT doesn't cover them, for example.
All right, so everyone can visit ISACA's new digital trust webpage, isaca.org/digital-trust. You'll see that on your screen shortly. There you can find a free white paper, some additional content, videos, and at the end of the month, ISACA members will have access to a free digital trust course. So it's a great time to use the benefits of your membership or to encourage your colleagues to become members if they're not already. So thank you, Mark and Karen, for a great conversation. It was great to speak with you. And thank you all for coming today.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.